Hello everyone, today we talk about the 15th century English liveried retainer for our historical military units series. We will talk about liveries rather than the soldier in itself, because we will definitely cover a lot of different unit types on the basis of tactical specialization, etc. So we're not looking at the typology of soldier. Could be just even a man-at-arm as much as an archer, right? And or like the guy inserted here in the thumbnail, that is a billman, as a matter of fact. And we will observe this too, because of course the livery wasn't the only thing here that, as we will see, was issued fundamentally by actually provided by the same lord. These guys were under, and it's interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, just the general sort of uniformological interest. We'll talk about the livery, the badge, and you know that I have a playlist that deals a bit with this sort of, in fact, uniforms, military dress, etc. I will not dissect here the difference between the two things. You can't, you know that I'm not fussy about this. There is, of course, a difference. It's difficult to speak of uniforms in the modern sense, of course, but it's still a step towards uniformation. Not even today you have absolute uniformation. It depends on the need. But it's also interesting to observe the English dimension of this, right? Because it does seem that in England, liveries were more widespread than in the rest of Europe. I will also make a video about the French liveried retainer. We will see this for other countries as well. So first of all, let's explain what's a livery, right? Livery is essentially a robe worn by this retainer, right, a lord's follower, bearing his badge and colors, right? And a livery for soldiers essentially referred to a distinctive uniform or attire provided by the lord or nobleman to his military retainers or serving men in general. It was not just a military thing, as you know. And the latter, though, would be called as liveried, in fact, men-at-arms, liveried archers, etc. These soldiers were not part necessarily of the king's army, right? They could be, right? There were some, of course, being retainers of the same lord in a way. Think about the yeomen of the guard, etc. I made a couple of years ago a video about this sort of early uniform. It was a bit in general, but there was a substantial reference to the famous green and white uniform worn by the troops from Wales, Cheshire, Flint, as one of the earliest documented, right? Now, don't make the mistake of thinking that these were like the first time they were appearing in history. It was a substantial degree of uniformation already at some levels, but of course it happened on a smaller scale, and also with sort of so less effectiveness, because it simply costs, right, to equip troops with this ways. And as we'll see, it's not quite the uniform that matters, rather the collar, the badge, and these can easily be worn out after just a couple of months of campaign, right? So we must understand the political meaning of this rather than just the military one, as Clausewitz and we know the instrumental relation. So here we're talking about a typical, say, soldiers employed by a typical lord, right? And these guys were employed directly by this guy to be a lord nobleman to serve and protect their household, right? And the livery provided to these soldiers would typically comprise a distinctive set of clothing, often in the colors and heraldic devices of the lord or the nobleman they served. Not necessarily, though, could be of different colors. We will see it now. And this clothing could include a variety of garments, including a doublet or tunic, hose or leggings, a cloak, and a hat or cap. And as we will see now, also armor could be covered, in fact, in fabric. It was normal, could be also painted. We will see now, again, the importance of the color, especially as far as the cloth that was provided was concerned, because normally these guys were issued by the lord just the colored cloth And then they had essentially to create the vest by themselves, right? If they knew how to, could of course pay a tailor, etc. This is really normal throughout all the also the early modern age, right? I also made a video about Tudor military dress, so you can have a continuity here chronologically from the 15th century if you're interested. Of course, the materials used would vary based on the financial capabilities of the lord or nobleman, with wealthier households often providing more luxurious fabrics such as wool, silk, or velvet. And this was in many ways the point of it all, right? That these guys were equipped by a lord who was so powerful that could think even could afford even the cost of standardizing this guy's uniform, right? This is a concept that when you extend it still in pre-industrial times to I don't know the Roman army, right? We're talking about in the hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Well, you understand that there wasn't technically even the capacity to, or at least it would have cost a lot, right, just to standardize the color uniform. I made a video, one of my early ones, of the colors of the Roman army, and there was a degree of uniformity, but very often at a lower level, and also because of just the way, even in the early empire, soldiers could de facto customize their own equipment to some degree. Mostly the uniform color would have been at a court or century level in that case. So that's why it's important here to understand, of course, the political and military context of England, also the social one in the 15th century, in order to explain also why this was seemingly, in fact, a more common thing in the country. And it's very interesting. I'd say the more perceptive of you will already have in mind, Wars of the Roses. I made some videos on 15th century English warfare already referring actually to these things, but it's also really a social stuff, right? There is a substantial difference between France and England. Doesn't matter how feudal these countries were, there were still important differences that I explain in some videos about the administration of the two countries. We will essentially mention them later to explain why this was the case. Now, so the livery would often display the lord's coat of arms or badge prominently, serving as a visual representation of the soldier's allegiance and connection to the household. This allowed the soldiers to be easily identified as members of a specific noble household, not just in battle, right, but also publicly, politically. And this would distinguish them from soldiers serving other lords or noble families. As we will see now, there were also liveries issued by cities, right, city militias and so on. And this was part of the very colorful side of the story. Today we could have referred also to the French liveries, the one of, say, the Flemish communes, the Italian liveries, etc. Every country really had the same thing, right? This is not, again, an English prerogative, but it does seem that England was was tidier and sort of more organized in this sense, and we'll again see now why. And in addition to the clothing, a soldier's livery might also include other accessories, of course, such as insignia or badges, belt fittings, buckles, and even weapons like swords or daggers with the lord's crest or emblem incorporated into these items as well. Today we do not really look at that. We stop to clothing fundamentally, but always remember that what a medieval soldier looked like, of course, was especially regarding to this symbolism that was, of course, connected with coat of arms and or however had a meaning, with mottos, with colors. They referred to something that people at the time understood quite clearly in a symbolical way, spiritual, traditional way, was all one, right? We often overlook how colorful a medieval army really was, right? And especially when you have all these households that are taking the field. And this had always been a thing, just now you see that the thing takes up a greater systematization. Wearing the livery provided by the noblemen was not only a form of uniformity, but also a mark of privilege and status for the soldiers. Right? They served their lord, so in exchange they were provided with part of his power, de facto. This indicated their association with the noble household. It helped foster a sense of loyalty and allegiance among the retainers, and helped to instill discipline and unity within the lord's household. Right? There is an immediate sort of recognition that does bring, also from a moral point of view in combat, that awareness of being part of a group, of having those values, and even saving your life to some degree, at least, hopefully. So when we look at a bit at the reasons why England, compared to the rest of Europe, seems to have made a more widespread use of military liveries in the 15th century, has to do essentially with the different relation that the English nobility had, say, compared to the French one, especially connected with local communities. Right? In France, you had already by the 13th century essentially a sort of middle ground, right, formed by a bourgeois bureaucracy, right, administration, a nobility that had been strongly segmented, with very powerful lords at the top that had really sort of armies on their own, yes, but still too large to simply be uniform in this way. And then lots of other knights that were also serving abroad, etc., making actually the backbone of the same French army, but that were sort of within this enormous hierarchy rather than horizontal division, right? In England, and the state would, in France, develop like that, right? There would be an increasing sort of level of middleman between the king, the higher nobility, and how the country was practically run, right? Naturally, the nobility, also the smaller aristocracy, etc., was superior to the bourgeoisie, but the divide with the rest of the population was much more vertical. In England, instead, things went differently, right? So after the Magna Carta, all the various provisions that fundamentally limited monarchic power, the English nobility manages to maintain a direct, almost private control at a local level on the various communities that inhabited the country. We've seen it also as far as the degree of liberty of the English peasantry actually being relatively low because of this. So you don't have in England like a sort of super state for medieval standards that places itself in between the monarchy, the nobility, the rest of the system. Right? It's the aristocracy that really rules just in the various shires. The English, let's say, the monarchic agents do not quite go too far in that regard, and or are themselves co-opted into sort of this more privatistic system. Reason for which, right, the say the divide between the various, the houses were, these aristocratic houses would be individually more important when they had to manifest their political alignment with the crown, or let's say the opposing aristocracy, and there was much more horizontal divide. This would naturally require a greater horizontal division to understand who was who, right, among these groups. And as we know, during the wars of let's say, England throughout the 100 Years' War has a very updated military system that, as you know, is also quite effective, especially from a tactical point of view. And there are large armies. They're usually not as big as the French ones. But of course, this need of overall uniformity was not so much needed, because, say, the bigger the army, the bigger the wars, the easier you have the recognition of who's who in this context. Of course, we will see it now, the various lords already had employed overseas in France during the chevauchée, etc., of course, liveried troops of their retainers, because, of course, within the same army they had to recognize each other. There was all a political and military necessity for that, so it's not that it had not existed. But, as you know, when the English fundamentally lose the 100 Years' War, they turn inwards, right? And during the Wars of the Roses, so this series of civil wars between the rival noble houses of Lancaster and York, and I made, multiple battle videos. I made a video about the Wars of the Roses in general, the tactics of them, etc. And we have explained there, I think, fairly well, how compact these armies were, how fundamentally the wars did not really devastate the country more than much, because they had as their major, they were dynastic struggles, right? So the major purpose was to recognize that guy on the field, that lord, that nobleman, and hopefully taking it out. And in spite of this, it was still very functional to for the same guy, as it is still until the rifle barrels and the automatic machine guns in the second half of the 19th century, that you want to actually stand out. You must, right? Because you are the leader, you're the guy in charge. You must be recognized with your colors. You are essentially gambling this out in these engagements that decimate actually the House of the Lords, as you know, that greatly favored eventually the power concentration in the Tudor era. And as a consequence, in this specific phase, you need liveries making this very important job of identifying the soldiers on the battlefield, as well as distinguishing the loyalty of the various factions. Right, so the use of liveries actually became more significant as the conflict during the Wars of the Roses intensified. Meaningfully enough, during the Wars of the Roses, even the membership to some military order was less represented in liveries than, let's say, the allegiance, right, to one specific party, right? For example, the Lancastrian SS was a particularly common device. The reason the SS has an interesting story, right? Nobody really knows what it means, right? There is great historiographical speculation. S is thought to essentially represent the Lancastrian motto "Souvenez," that is to say, you remember you. So what we are, here for. There is also a later "Souvenez me souviens," that is, remember me often, right? Souviens, souvent. I don't know whether it's you could spell it both ways at the time, because medieval language, but there is, for the rest, not much of another hypothesis. Some said that it stands for seneschal, right, the office of Lord High Steward that had been held by the earls and dukes of Lancaster from 1265 until the time of Henry IV. But this doesn't ring right, because especially when the same Lancasters were kings and were fighting, with that, what would be the point of remembering that there were sort of seneschals and this sort of original loyalty to the monarchy that now they were themselves, right? The Yorkists had the so-called sunburst livery colors throughout the entire century. There are other let's say, examples from, I don't know, Yorkist livery colors of sunbursts and roses, of course, with the characteristic color. The Lancastrians, in fact, wearing similar livery colors bearing the aforementioned SS motive, right? The Yorkist livery was blue over Murray, and were naturally different. Say, look at the insignia, etc. I think we haven't made a video on that yet, no. But we will see it. Of course, it varied from monarch to monarch, from lord to lord, etc. It was really crucial, right, to be identified. So today we do not digress on flags, etc. I just recently made a video on Western European, but as a whole, sort of difference between standard banners, etc. That can be a useful guide. During the Wars of the Roses, town contingents, as we were recalling, wore their own liveries. Right, Coventry, for example, issued its militiamen with green and red uniforms. Rye in 1461 and Canterbury in 1470 had red uniforms. So you see how this is really normal in general. Consider also this fact that the 15th century is sort of the most armored century ever, right? So these liveries that, say, now it's a bit difficult to digress, but let's say that during the 15th century we have the greatest combination of sort of smaller forces, right, but loaded individually in cost, right, and this would increase the likelihood of liveries, right? This happens because in the mid-14th century, in the crisis, the system had yet to fully reboot with armies that England wouldn't quite have, by the way, because they sort of remain feudal in nature, right? From the War of the Roses, after the 100 Years' War, you have Britain fundamentally starting to lag behind until the new model army regarding to continental development. So on the continent you have ever larger uniformed armies of pikemen, etc., that tend to be, in part, as we've seen, not necessarily more uniform, like not think in the sense larger armies, more uniformity, right? It's really a different world, right? The Wars of the Roses are really a very, say, exemplificative tail strike of true medieval feudalism, right, compared to what was instead essentially kicking in Europe with the Swiss and their imitations, right, elsewhere. So it's important to look at the origins of liveries in the same England, right? We know they were around since the 13th century. At least we know that explicitly, but of course we have to think that this stuff was already present before. There is a beautiful source, which is the Romance of Alexander. It's a manuscript, right, dated around the 30s to 40s of the 14th century, where at the beginning of the 100 Years' War, there's also yet another manuscript showing this, right, and both showing, this is why I mentioned them, unarmored archers in mi-partie liveries, which means that they had basically one color from one side, say, longitudinally on the body, right, and the other, right, and they would, I don't know, imagine one of these guys as, there are archers, by the way, so bear it in mind, because as we will see, of course, especially in English warfare, archers, as you know, were not just quite important as a whole, but they could have different levels of quality, right, and so at some point being paid even as knights, we will see it, right. This was absolutely not typical, don't get me wrong, and hence also the great numerical disparity within the same English armies between the men-at-arms and the many more archers, right, but there was some sort of hyper-professionalism that would bring, a component of the archers that were true soldiers, right. These were indentured troops largely, paid by, say, equipped, etc., by various noblemen, lords that fought as men-at-arms in the same units, right? And that wanted, we'll see it better in the end with some specifics from certain documents, their archers even to be uniform in this way. Could have, I don't know, a red-white tunic and hood plus, I don't know, blue-green hose, white arming cap, black shoes. We find this stuff around, right? And it is abundantly clear through these sources that liveried troops, or uniform in some other ways, to have been fairly commonplace in England, even before the 100 Years' War, right? For example, we know of a 200-man strong contingent from Queen Isabella's lands in 1327. We know this uniformity presence also among siege engineers, meaningful enough in 1333. Sometimes these guys were, as you know, quite prized because they, say in Europe, they could be found also at a close range. But if you look at the at Asian armies, even the Mongols, etc., they often were brought like with as specialists from even transcontinental journeys, right, with the army. We find troops from London in 1334 and a contingent of 600 archers under Sir Thomas Agerthred in 1335 being so uniformed. We know from Richard II's 1388 Parliament that since 1327, but in fact in many cases even earlier, right, lords had essentially provided their retainers with household badges, right? The use of badges is important as well because it reached essentially its height from the mid-14th century to the beginning of the 16th, right? So this was also the same mean of, perhaps even a more important mean of identification, a sign of allegiance to a particular lord, right? Because at the end of the day, it was also more likely to bear the herald or more symbolically loaded, right, design. We know of badges sometimes worn as on the sleeve, that is to say, technically the left shoulder. However, they could, as we will see better now, also worn in the front and in the back, right? So on the breast, and the back. From around the 30s of the 14th century, it's really under Edward III that these livery things seems to take off, right? Especially in documentation. The normal term for it was for livery was sectum, actually secta plural, right? Archers were described as wearing the secta, so their employers. We think that, of course, in these earlier times, there wasn't much concrete uniformity in the type of cloth rather than the color, because the color, again, was the already, like the cloth was already provided colored, right? But and that's what concretely mattered if you think about this by medieval standards on the battlefield, that you had, say, a group of soldiers that was trained to fight together and that would be more readily identifiable, right, on the field. And here, as we've seen, we're talking about tactically complete unit men-at-arms archers, I mean the protagonists of the great English victories of the 100 Years' War. One of the best, if not the best, representation of these liveries comes, however, from the very end of the 15th century, and it is John Roos' pageant of the birth, life and death of Richard Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, right? We are around 1485-90, right? And this manuscript displays all the various retainers wearing, in this case, Warwick's livery, consisting in a red jacket with white ragged staves in the front and in the rear. There are interesting scenes, such as the one which King Henry V presents a commission to Warwick at Calais in 1415, fatal year. There is yet another Earl of Warwick, actually Richard Neville, that had 200 men-at-arms and 400 archers dressed in that kind of livery, right, when he attended the Great Council of Westminster in 1458. The political occasion was meaningful enough because it was way to show off, right? All the great councils, diets in the Middle Ages were very often a moment of political testing, right? A sort of political thermometer, and of course they were mostly connected with the need to raise forces and just presenting yourself as a lord, as a nobleman with your armed retinues that, in addition to this good to their, say, deterrent, let's say, their threat, if you want, were also so magnificently clothed, all in uniform, etc. What did make a great impression. Never underestimate the psychological impact of uniforms, right? Because throughout warfare, that's fundamentally what their role was. Because when you find yourself in front of you an enemy that, in addition to, that's the basic, hopefully for the enemy, having intense training, good armament, etc., even has the sort of style, right, the sort of uniformity, sort of, looking like a block, right, all of a single color, and identifying with that, and makes you think, damn, these guys found, even in conditions of great deprivation, like mostly campaigns were, for which these uniforms would actually wear themselves away after a while, but in especially the big showdowns, major pitched battles, saying, wow, right, they thought about that too, right, about the uniform clothing, etc. It is a huge deal in many ways. And then there's all the practical sort of political show that is, look, that's those guys with that livery, that's that lord, I have to kill that guy, right, and or I want to spare that, right. You've heard before that detail that the badges were worn on the breast and in the back, meaning that in combat, at least, somebody would like to know whose guy you were killing, right? You may have found this, right, in moments of betrayal, that were quite common at some point too, but we've seen very messed up battles. We've seen Barnet, we've seen Tewkesbury, where sometimes soldiers really roamed around it. You wouldn't even know what kind of unit was in the mist, or popping up like some place from some unexpected direction on the battlefield, right? And identifying that was quite relevant. And unfortunately, we don't know much details about the means of recognition. Naturally, there were banners, there were passwords, etc. But there is a very telling example regarding the relevance of these liveries, which would even, in fact, give a name to a battle of the Wars of the Roses. Actually, it was an important one, right? Because there were tens of thousands of soldiers, but it was not much of a fight, just a rout, right? We're talking about the Battle of Losecoat Field, that, from the name already gives you a hint there, fought on March the 12th, 1470. Essentially, this was a rout by King Edward IV of allegedly 30,000 Lincolnshire rebels under Sir Robert Wells. This was backed by Warwick and George, Duke of Clarence, right? And essentially, as Edward IV's artillery fired, right, a few rounds, right, the rebels broke and fled, throwing off their livery tunics, so as to escape recognition, right? And there you get the name of the battle. By the way, this was sort of significant affair, just because Wells was captured and executed. But you can imagine all these liveries left on the field, hence the name of the battle per se. Not one of the most relevant of famous of the Wars of the Roses, but we will see this in some detail, even though it's literally just what I said, right? It was not even a battle, it was just, again, scaring these guys off and making them flee, right? We find, by the way, as I was hinting at before, some examples of body armor covered in fabric. For example, the white taffeta with a blue border that Edward III, back in the day, had given to the Earl of Lancaster in 1348. There is also, I made a video about the Battle of Poitiers, the masterpiece of the Black Prince, who gave to one of his followers an armor covered in black velvet embroidered with white ostrich feathers. This was a livery. We'll see now this the symbol, by the way, recurring. So you understand that this practice was as old as warfare to some extent, and it was just taking greater shape in the later Middle Ages. And again, mostly because of the contraction of the big armies of the early 14th century, the sort of professionalization of warfare, the aristocratization, reprivatization of warfare, and as a consequence, the need to identify these guys as, say, a professional, handful compared to the increasingly demilitarized rest of the population, that thus had to be first of all recognized in that sort of aristocratized sort of political milieu, but also because they were more loaded, ever more costly, also in arms and armor, and so, say, paying for their liveries was not really the greatest of expenses per se, right? There was properly a contract known as livery and maintenance, right, for which the lord's retainers were hired, right, were contracted, right. This livery colors, as we were saying before, would normally or usually be the two principal colors from the lord's or nobleman coat of arms, and these guys would be maintained at their expenses throughout, say, you see, livery and maintenance is as if they were one the same thing or the other. They came all together. It was, of course, a moment where you realized that noblemen were sort of more arrogant, more autonomous, right? They were sort of greater threat to stability. Who were these retainers, by the way? Well, mostly the yeomen, so essentially freehold peasants, but by the 15th century, essentially specifically prosperous peasants, whether freeholders or not, as well as franklins, that is, freehold farmers, right? So constituting, so you can say yeomen, but this time also lesser gentry, right, entering in this specific, again, livery and maintenance form of contract, whereby they undertook to wear the baron's livery. And this, again, put them personally in the game, politically. As I was saying before, right, with this sort of, especially after the end of the 100 Years' War, this further disintegration of the monarchy by some degree, and this complex arising, the nobility were, now that they had lost also their French landholdings, were essentially venting within Britain and making leverage on their own, say, communities at home, right? So these were just the lord's guys. You understand how close this connection really was in that context, right? Hence the household badge, the collars, etc. They were really a responsibility, right? It was a clientele relation, and in return, these retainers would, of course, for risking their lives for their lords, etc., carrying out missions and so on, they would receive protection whenever they needed it, right? So it's just like mafia, right? Wherever the state gets weaker, of course, that personal bond reemerges at a smaller scale. So when you look at a typical army of the Wars of the Roses, you realize that this contingent consisted of a magnate's personal or household troops, right, or bodyguard if you want. So you have the knights, right, so the men-at-arms in a heavier sense. So you have sergeant with different equipment. It could be pikemen, billmen, etc., and then archers, right, that were, as we'll see now, again, very prized, especially in this context. You would have also the lord's tenants together, even with mercenaries. Of course, these did exist from other countries in Europe during the same Wars of the Roses. And for the most technical tasks, as we've seen before, the engineers, but also as just troopers, mostly foreign in this case, specialized in gunnery, hand gunnery. But, and this is particularly relevant, the livery and maintenance troops were something separated from all of this, right? They could get, don't get me wrong, all the aforementioned troops could, of course, and would, in part, get this sort of livery, etc. But the maintenance process was specifically referring to this properly sort of retinue relation, like the old masnata, if you want. So essentially this meant what? That they were provided with the equipment, right? But they were unpaid, right? And the reason why this was the case is that they had essentially a personal stake in the fighting for their lord, right? So this is, again, particularly important because remember that this sort of private feudal mentality, well, this is exactly the point. These guys worked for the local lord, and their fortune, in a sense, was tied to their same lord's success. And they would do it just for a living. After all, again, they were maintained, right? So it was just a way to become also closer to the guy, because the other troops were contractors too, right? So the say the same yeoman, so these guys could be anyone, right? They didn't necessarily have to be, say, this guy or the other. They would enter the lord's retinue in different ways, and they would calibrate that so that the guy could also rely on them more closely, etc. Right? So there were all these various layers, say, of fidelity, of clientele relation, and so on, right? Consider also another aspect for which the liveries became important. That by the mid-15th century, the shield, the jupon or tabard, the helmet, crest, were fundamentally declining, right? So these were used only during tournaments. Consequently, the only way of sort of identifying a soldier during more or less the period of the Wars of the Roses was restricted to, first, the standards, which were, as you know, the rallying point for the troops on the field and so on. But individually, like when it got down to the, say, the banners identified the individual men-at-arms at some point as well, depending on who they were. But the other troops had to be liveried, right? They had to be badged. And so this is the reason, as we've seen in the political and social background of the Wars of the Roses, why liveries and badges become really common for the soldier, and their primary, essentially, mean of identification ad personam. Liveries were also known as gowns. They were de facto also tunics at some point, and they were worn over body armor. That was becoming really, like, at this point, really the norm, even for the average trooper, right? In the past, of course, fully armored troops were rare, right? So in the 15th century, especially among these retinues, instead you have even an average guy still having, like, it was, even if he had wanted to have another type of equipment on its own, say from the 14th century, an average archer even could buy a sword. It wasn't that costly after all, if you really needed just a mediocre one, right? And at this point, armor was pretty much everywhere among fighters. And yes, there were lighter troops, let's say, don't get me wrong, not archers could also be more likely, or anybody, right, just lighter infantry in general, more likely equipped. Another important aspect to understand about liveries is that there wasn't such a thing like a strict heraldic law, let's say, defining them, right? The colors could be the ones of the Lord's coat of arms, or at his pleasing, another one, right? They could have also no relation in that regard. For example, the retainers and followers of the great Percy family wore a livery of russet, yellow, and orange, with the blue lion rampant of the Percy arms on their shoulders. And the actual tinctures of the Percy coat of arms were azure and or, so they were not the colors of the soldiers' livery. Before the Second Battle of St. Albans, we know that Queen Margaret had her men uniformed in some sort of livery with which they were marching. The companies raised by the towns, as we've seen, had their own livery as well. The Chamberlain of Nottingham's accounts for 1463-64 list 56 shillings and 3 pennies spent for jackets for soldiers that were riding right to reach the king at York. Also, red cloth was specified for the troops, a fine red cloth, especially for the captain, right? Consider the, again, different status in the hierarchy. White fustian was used to make the letters, of course, to have, of course, light reflecting on them and making them more apparent. And these were presumably sewn onto the jackets. At least we have this info, and that's how we can expect them to have happened. Henry VIII's yeomen of the guard had the Tudor livery, white and green stripes with a red rose within a wine breath on chest and back. Chest and back, see, again, this was surely a, again, you had to watch out you were backstabbing, right, in practice. And let's be honest, like, the lifestyle of these people was quite violent, right? They were just, literature is quite eloquent about this, right? Even fiction, but inspired to real facts, these men were always at risk out there. They would engage in brawls. At some point, they had to sort of make justice, to intimidate, they could ambush and being ambushed. So, again, that they had to earn all that maintenance, as the contract said, right? The right to use a badge at some point was properly codified as we've seen, it was not normal really to have, say, lords' retinues simply deciding to acquire notoriety also in public through such ways of recognition. So the king had to allow such badge to those noblemen, by the way, that were capable of fielding, also because of the royal demand, a large company at least, right? So that was accepted because, after all, these men were important, and so there is always a degree of private relations that also, in this case, can help co-opting these guys, and so rendering the various units within the army more loyal to the crown, etc. And normally the right to wear a badge went in parallel with the one to use a standard, right? It became official and serious. We are mostly in Tudor times, not only, but as we were recalling, during the Wars of the Roses, everything was a bit more loose, right? A bit of a Far West, where badges were adopted just at convenience of the various lords. The badges could be of two types, right? A personal one and the one of the lord, which could be, in the latter case, used only by him, right? And reserved for use on his also banner, right? The badge was repeated, of course, and was normally part of the, say, of the heraldry, as we've seen, not necessarily, but it could figure in banners that were different in different years, right? If you look at the banners of the various kings, of the same king, actually, during the various years of the Wars of the Roses, you see that there were different statements, different slogans used. We will see it better in a dedicated video. And the badge was thus used on banners sometimes, even instead of the coat of arms during these wars. It could be even easier. We've seen it in the video about flag in general, like to identify than the actual coat of arms that could be quite complex and so not easily decipherable at a certain distance. So if you had just the badge, it was normally something simpler than the coat of arms, or even just a device of the saint that was quite more identificative. It would be preferred, especially on the battlefield, where, of course, that recognition necessity was greater for practical purpose. The household badge was thus a sort of mark of ownership, especially for as we've seen, these retinues that were literally maintained by the lord, right? So it was a standard of loyalty. You knew if you wanted to take on these guys that they were that lord's guys, so you had to be wary yourself, and it came with specific responsibilities. Because the household badges were widely used, so on flags, liveries, etc., they were paradoxically also more popular among commoners than the same lord's arms, right? They really facilitated the interpretation. There were some public offices that were being more permanent, having become more permanent, were sort of easier to recognize by anyone, right? For example, there was a badge for the guy responsible for the supplies of the royal army as such, that was at some point just very notorious. Everybody would recognize it, instead of all the many ones that existed for the nobility. This badge originally was a WD shaped one, right? That is quite simple symbol after all, and simplicity. as far as the visual recognition was again the keyword here. You could simply, I don't know, in a desperate situation in battle, identify just the guy that is next to you and simply regroup on the basis of that, right, without losing other time, right, even when the banner was lost, right. So it had really many different purposes. The reason why this had not yet appeared historically at some point is that it cost too much compared to the practical purpose at the end of the day, because that advantage is not going really to save the situation, especially if the unit is already broken, so it's spent. But just to give you the idea of, say, the balance between the various factors. We have an interesting letter from the so-called Paston ones that were collected from the correspondence between the members of the Paston family of the Norfolk gentry between 1422 and 1509. We are in the second half of 15th century. This document specifically tells us of the importance of longbowmen during the Wars of the Roses, and part of this is gathered from the cost, right, of the equipment, including the livery code that we will see now. Alright, so the Sir John Paston was about to depart for Calais, right, an expedition to France, and he asked essentially his brother to try, at least to recruit four archers for him. And he sent men, likely men in fair condition and good archers. They shall have 4 marks by year as a pay, and my livery. That's how it worked, right? They were maintained through this annuity, and plus they had the, again, responsibility and privilege of wearing his Sir John Paston's livery, right? Permanent retainers, as you understand. So the typical guys that we're discussing here. These were also ordinary archers, right? There wasn't any extra like elite character of de maison sort of characterization. They had just to serve permanently in the household forces of a great lord like Paston. Warwick considered such men to be, however, superior in quality, because they were more loyal. They were in general expected to do so, and double in this quality, right? This could extend also to foreigners, so that they would be better than an English guy in double. Were 2 of them actually. In 1467, Sir John Howard hired an archer, given him £10 a year. £10 a year is as much as a knight was paid annually, right? Plus, he provided these guys with 2 gowns, so 2 liveries, and a house even for his wife. Now, this was not the norm, but they were still archers, right? So you can't mistake here the fact that doesn't matter how, in fact, normally a man-at-arms was paid, certain of these retainer archers could be paid as much as one of these guys, right? This shouldn't, of course, make us conclude that archers were technically just as powerful as a man-at-arms in this context, because, as you will see now, the proportions were, say, incredibly unbalanced in favor, of course, of the quality of the knight for many reasons. But the connection between these guys and the lord could be more important politically than even the military performance as such. The same Sir John Howard gave the aforementioned man to whom had paid, let's say, the cost of a night and even a house for the wife, 2 shillings and 8 penny, 2 doublets worth 10 shillings each, and a new gown. So this livery coat, that's the term you can use interchangeably at this point. An important quality, evidently. At some point, Sir John Howard buys a new bow for himself. The bow was becoming at this point a sort of national, mark, right, of the English in general, especially among the gentry, right. But of course, a man-at-arms, etc., was normally trained to use any kind of weapons, right? So they were no stranger to that. He paid for his own, Howard paid for his own bow 2 shillings. And he bought, however, for the aforementioned elite archer of his 4 bows costing 5 shillings and 11.5 pennies each, plus a new case, a shooting glove, bowstrings, and a sheaf of arrows costing 5 shillings. Now, this is an incredible expense, after all, for a single guy, right? And of course, this guy was surely, again, privileged for reasons that we do not clearly understand. If we were to judge only from the cost, we are sure that this armament was essentially the best available at the time. So for with the best ammo, with some of the finest logs, so the best of the best could be spent at the time for a single guy. It evidently here had a wife for which the Lord buys a house, etc. There was a strong connection of some sort. But just to make a quick proportion, like for making you understand what, however, the numerical ratios really were, if we look at the French expedition of Edward IV in 1475, we find in the retinues of the following lords this amount of troops: Duke of Clarence, 10 men-at-arms, 1,000 archers; Duke of Gloucester, 10 men-at-arms, 1,000 archers; Duke of Norfolk, 2 men-at-arms, 300 archers; Duke of Suffolk, 2 men-at-arms, 300 archers; and the Duke of Buckingham, 4 men-at-arms and 400 archers. Right. Now, it should be pointed out, however, that these archers are not all archers, but the name had taken over even the spearmen, that actually we know being of this force 334 against 2,802 archers. Alright, so we're talking essentially 1/10, right, of the total force next to the men-at-arms, but it gives you still an idea of the disproportion, right, of in number between the heavy and the light infantry. So of course, even if you have very good archers, still these are not the decisive arm. We've seen it many times in our 100 years war, not only videos, right? So the practice of livery and maintenance existed well in through our period here, 15th century, and it would actually become, right, a source of disturbance after the defeat in the 100 Years' War, because there were many, as we've seen, the Wars of the Roses witnessed fairly contained engagements, right, that were especially fought ad hoc without too much of a campaign dragging, right, or need of distraction or plunder, etc. Part of the reason being exactly this sort of parity of the various nobility was to take each other out, but not to destroy what they could seize at that point by dynastic right of inheritance, etc. But when you look at these numbers, when you look at these retainers, the fact they existed together with the mercenaries, with other troops who were normally levied from the gentry, the yeomen, etc., you realize that there was a substantial amount of people for which these retainers especially would be the most active, right? That had no other life but the one of the soldier. Right, so when they came back to England after the 100 Years' War, they were not just, in many cases, grizzled veterans with great experience, but they would act for this reason as mercenaries for the various lords. And that's in part this sort of retinue relation that existed between them, and betting on the one that you thought would win, and at that point getting the right also of representing him through the badge and livery, etc. That's what hunger does as well, because of course without war there was, at least without war on the continent, there was less to profit on a regular basis, and in England you had to come back after, hopefully, at some point, so you couldn't quite do the same there, right? And this would, say, provide with a specific character even the rest of military history in the country, but we will say this on another occasion. I thought it was important to highlight this, not just talking about liveries, but appreciating sort of the political, social context of this kind of troops, right, and why we talk about them specifically, and we appreciate them even for this sort of really elite role in some cases. Well, not entirely, as you understand, but these were the guys you would nurture more directly, right? Others you would hire for necessity, eventually have to disband. These guys lived with you, right? You paid them something, you maintained them, and they had a specific, hopefully, of course, sense of, let's say, of dependence, and of course of loyalty, of thankfulness, right, that you would have to exploit by making them do what you had, by the way, paid them to do, because it was more or less, let's say, a consensual contract, right? So these guys were hired for that particular role, and they were connected to it because of the, of course, of the status that could reach through that. Always remember that in the Middle Ages, it was often the sort of the poorer elements that at some point, because of their greater subjection to the lords, made it to the top quicker than even the sort of more affluent people, freer people in a way. Right here we are, of course, in a very advanced situation, but considering the role of, say, the contract of the indenture, the sort of the mercenary relations, etc., very often these people had not much to lose, right? So this was a quite prestigious role, because as we've seen also in terms of expenses, you couldn't have too many of these people, right? So it was just limited, there were limited places for it, but they were good ones, right? High risk but high pay after all, and that's something that a veteran especially could actually accept. For today, however, stop it here. We will hopefully keep talking about this broader context, the 100 Years' War, the Wars of the Roses, let's say this different livery development also in other countries, because there were different dynamics as far as that is concerned. For today, however, again, stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.